So we've tried to generalize this idea. Can we build vast arrays of optical elements so we can control all these different parts and screen through the brain, as it were, looking for and discovering the parts that might be important for a given disorder? And I should point out that this is a tool that is in widespread use. We only developed the tools. All of the applications are chiefly being done by scientists all over the place, including many people here at this institution. Now, there's a hope potentially that you could actually treat disorders using such tools as well. And this is something that's in the future. Of course, this requires putting these molecules into the brain, and that's something that has never been done before for humans. But it's appealing to think about the possibility, because if you could enter information very precisely into a part of the brain or a neural circuit, maybe you could treat disorders that are not possible to treat in other ways. One area that's gotten to be quite interested in this technology is in the field of trying to treat blindness. Perhaps 15 to 20 million people around the world suffer from forms of blindness where the cells in our eye, specialized neurons that capture light and transform light into signals that our brain can understand, die off. And so if those cells die, there's not a whole lot that can be done. There's no drug that could, what would the drug bind to? There's nothing for it to do. On the other hand, light can still get into the eye. And so there's hope that if you could try to stimulate some of the remaining cells, then that could allow images to be conveyed into the nervous system. Think of it as sort of like deep brain stimulation, but now like a camera. And electricity is great, but it also spreads, as we talked about earlier, in all of the directions. So you don't get very good images if you use electricity alone. And so what if you could just take those little solar cells we talked about earlier and install them on the remaining cells to convert them into a camera directly? And so many groups have explored this. Once again, it's mostly in the animal model stage. But you can see here a blind mouse trying to solve a little maze. The maze has 6 arms. And the goal of the mouse is not to get stuck in one of these arms, but to climb out of the maze. There's a little bit of water in the maze, old neuroscience methodology to help the maze make progress. And the mouse will then try to climb out onto that little platform. And the mouse is blind. It turns out that many mice, like the kind you find at pet stores, are blind. In this case, you can see the mouse trying to solve it. And mice are smart, so eventually he figures it out. But he's not using the eye to do it. And so you can take those light-sensitive molecules from the algae, for example, put them into the eye of a blind mouse. This mouse was blind 6 weeks before. And now the mouse can go towards the platform and avoid the problem that the blind mouse had before, which was that it couldn't see where to go. So one of the big issues has been how do you find such a technology in order to try to help understand the brain, and maybe eventually, if these tools are proven to be safe and carried out, to help cure people. And so we've started an informal program to try to help connect people who have solutions to people who have problems. There are all sorts of engineers who work on all sorts of aspects of making the world, everything from mechanical devices to the optical parts that run the internet and everything in between. And there are lots of problem people. People are trying to study disorders or try to treat the disorders and are stuck. And so what we've been doing in our group and also with some of our collaborators is to help find curators, people who can try to connect the solution people and the problem people. And it's a difficult thing to do because you have to match people up not only based upon their knowledge, but their willingness and their personality in a way that allows you to connect these different fields. In the same way that we took the protein from the algae, from the field of plant biology and put it into the brain to study things like addiction. And to do that requires a very large distributed network. This is just a list of some of the groups that we collaborate with in this quest to try to mine solutions to figure out what can be brought to bear upon the brain, and also to mine out problems to figure out which ones are ready to be tackled. And we basically try to track these problems and solutions and make matches between them when they seem appropriate. We've also started to try to help people to start businesses in this space. Entrepreneurship and the starting of ventures is a powerful way to get new ideas out into the world. And we started actually teaching at the business school at MIT a course on neurotechnology ventures, which allows people to try and figure out how to take their ideas and to get them out into the world so that people can be cured. And many of our students have gone on to try to develop new technologies that can do this. One of our students, for example, who was recently featured on the CNN News Network, has developed a brain scanner appropriate for infants to figure out who will come down with autism. And you could try to help people rehabilitate and prepare with language and other skills early in life before the problems are severe. Another one of our students has gone on to start a company to try to make little sensors that you can wear in a wristwatch so that you could try to figure out when you're about to have a depressive or panic attack and learn how your emotions work, to understand how your own mind works, and use this as a tool to allow yourself to help overcome or deal with the fluctuations of emotion that occur in bipolar disorder and depression and generalized anxiety disorders. So what will be the outcome of this in the years to come? Our hope is that there'll be a rich understanding of these circuits and how they work. And from that, we can take these cells and figure out what drugs should be developed, for example, in order to affect certain cells and not others, which is a very different approach from the kinds of things that were done 100 years ago to 50 years ago when this adventure of trying to engineer the brain really got into high gear through the advent of neuropharmacology. I think also, though, that as people realize more and more about the brain, it's going to shape other aspects of life, such as philosophy and how people live. We've already seen some of this, although it's very subtle and it's covert. But, for example, there are lots of changes in how people treat the mentally ill. It's no longer seen as a stigma the way that it was half a century ago, where people were sometimes blamed for their symptoms. Now it's understood that this is a change in the circuits and the chemicals that make up the brain. And so it changes how people deal with such problems at the societal level. You also see people in the field of behavioral economics trying to understand, why do people make the decisions that they do? Why do people sometimes make very foolish decisions? And this is starting to shape how the understanding of motivation is occurring. Can you help make people more rational, to overcome some of the biases that might entrench them in ways that are difficult to think about complex problems and solve them? And then finally, you see people starting to speculate about these big issues of justice and consciousness. We talked about Rebecca's work earlier, where stimulating a single part of the brain with a magnetic pulse can flip an otherwise normal individual's concept of justice. And also, consciousness itself is starting to be addressed. The deep brain stimulation technique you've heard about has started to be used even in people in a coma, in a otherwise non-responsive state. And there are parts of the brain that if you implant an electrode can actually kind of boot up the brain, that a person in a coma can start to respond, can hear their name, and can start to have some rudimentary behaviors when before they did not move or interact with people. It's an early stage. I would say that this is just getting going. But one has to remember that these experiments to try to restore consciousness to people really only began maybe 5 to 10 years ago. And then, of course, treating disorders of the brain. We talked a lot about how to treat very severe disorders. But as you saw, disorders that are non-life-threatening, but nevertheless very incapacitating, such as Tourette syndrome, for example, and depression, are starting to be addressed. And I think what's happening is that in the 20 years since the introduction of deep brain stimulation, as its safety and its efficacy becomes known and people become more comfortable with it, there's a natural trajectory where technologies start to broaden in their use. And you see this happening in the field of electrical stimulation already. Perhaps 250,000 people have some kind of electrical stimulator implanted into their nervous systems. And the ability to treat deafness, for example, with a cochlear implant, or to treat Tourette syndrome or other non-life-threatening but very disabling disorders is something that I think is starting to broaden people's perspective on what can be done to engineer the brain. Neuropharmacology, of course, has been an area where people have been trying to broaden the use of specific compounds. And we've already started to see forms of energy being used to do non-invasive stimulation as well. Recently, for example, a group started to try to use sound waves to stimulate the brain. Sound waves are nice because they can be focused to very, very deep points, whereas magnetic fields, if you've ever taken a barb magnet and looked at the iron filings that you sprinkle on it, you know that they tend to form closed loops. And so people are now trying to figure out, are there extensions of the ability to deliver energy into the brain that could be of use for the treating of brain disorders? Another area that's been of interest lately is to use even electrical currents applied across the brain to stimulate the brain. Recently, a group in Australia showed that if you apply a current across the brain in a specific way, you can actually increase the chance of somebody having a flash of insight by many-fold. And so it starts to raise questions about how creativity and the ways that people solve problems will change in the years to come. A group in Germany, working with medical students who needed to memorize things, also showed that by applying a current, you could increase memory retention, although the effects were small, maybe because they picked medical students who already know everything. So I think what you're going to see in the next several years is that people are going to start building systems that integrate all of these parts. The idea of a closed-loop stimulator that you've now heard about can be generalized in a way that allow all sorts of different aspects of life to be augmented through the use of neurotechnology. Can you collect data from the brain, even analyze what's going on to see what information needs to be added, and then finally, to insert information back in. And recently, several groups have demonstrated the ability to electrically stimulate the brain in patterns, so that you could, for example, replace a lost function, like a memory circuit that can no longer store information, or a circuit in the motor pathways of the brain that's important for movement. And so this is a very interesting time because people are starting to try to figure out how to use these tools that you've heard about, and also some new ones, to really sculpt the computations being performed by the circuits of the brain. So thank you.